I want to start with the wall. It was a thin wall, the kind they put up in an old summer cabin that was never meant for winters, never meant for families to live in year-round, just a partition, really a sheet of board between one little room and the next. And on one side of that wall, on the night I'm going to tell you about, 3 children were asleep. A boy of 5, a boy of 10, and a friend of theirs, a boy of 12. 3 children sleeping the way children sleep on a Saturday night in the mountains with no school in the morning. And on the other side of that wall, a few feet away, in the front room of that same small cabin, 3 people were being tied up and beaten and killed. The children slept through it, or they were left alive on purpose. To this day, no one is certain which, and I've come to believe that not knowing is its own kind of horror, to not even be sure whether mercy or simple chance is the reason those 3 little boys are alive today. They were right there, a few feet and one thin wall away from the worst thing I have ever heard of happening in this canyon. And in the morning they were found unharmed, and they could not between them give a clear account of the night, and one of them would spend years saying he had only dreamed it before, allowing that maybe he had seen it after all. And there was a 4th child, a 12-year-old girl. She was taken out the back door into the dark, and she did not come back, and it would be 3 years before anyone found even a part of her more than 60 miles away. That's where I have to begin, because that's the shape of the thing. Not a stranger come and gone like weather. Something that happened in the middle of a family, in the middle of a tiny community, where everyone knew everyone with children sleeping on the other side of the wall. And here is the part that has sat on this canyon like a stone for 40-some years, the part I'll come back to at the end. By everything the people who worked this case came to believe whoever did it did not drive in from far away. Whoever did it lived right here, walked the same gravel road, was a face we said good morning to. I've lived in this canyon most of my life. I knew Keddie when it was still a place and not a ghost. So let me tell you about it the way it was before, because you can't feel what was lost if you don't know what was there. Keddie sat down in the Feather River Canyon up in the northern Sierra in Plumas County high country, pine country a long way from anywhere. It was a railroad town first and always. The big rail line came through right there. There's a famous junction at Keddie, a place where the tracks split and cross on a high trestle, and railroad men knew the name even if nobody else did. And early in the century, somebody built a resort there, a lodge and a scatter of little cabins among the pines for city people to come up and fish the feather and breathe the mountain air. But by the time of my story, that resort had come down in the world. The fine days were long past. The cabins had slid from vacation rentals into cheap, month-to-month housing, the kind of place where the rent was low and nobody asked too many questions. A couple of dozen cabins strung along a gravel road. Some lived in some empty and going soft with rot, the forest leaning in close on every side. It was beautiful. Don't mistake me, it was beautiful. The pines and the river and the canyon walls, but it was the kind of beautiful that's also lonesome, isolated. The nearest real town, Quincy, was a drive away down the highway. At night it was dark, the way only the mountains get dark, with no bottom to it, and quiet enough that a sound carried. It was the kind of place people came to start over, and if I'm honest, the kind of place people came to disappear into. A mountain town where the rent is cheap and the trees are thick will draw both kinds, the ones trying to put a life back together and the ones trying to leave a life behind. They lived right next to each other up there. They borrowed each other's tools and watched each other's kids. That was the canyon. Everybody knowing everybody was the whole way of life. It was the thing that was supposed to keep you safe. And nothing ever happened there. That's what we all believed. Nothing ever happened in Keddie. The family was the Sharps, and they were new. Sue Sharp, Glenna was her given name, but everyone called her Sue, was 36 years old, and she had come all the way out from Connecticut just a few months before, in the back end of 1980. She'd separated from her husband and she had 5 children, and she'd come west to start clean partly because she had a brother living up that way. 5 months. That's all the time she'd had in that cabin before the night I'm telling you about. 5 months to begin a whole new life. She picked Keddie, I expect, for the same reasons anybody did. It was cheap, it was far from what she was leaving, and there was family nearby. A woman alone with 5 kids looking for a soft place to land. The children. The oldest was John 15. The man of the house now, the way the oldest boy gets to be when the father's gone. Then Sheila 14. Then Tina 12. Then the little ones Rick, who was 10, and Greg the baby just 5 years old. 5 children in a cabin that wasn't built for a family in a canyon a long way from the only home they'd ever known. But children are quick to take root. They'd made friends already among the other cabins. They'd started to belong. That's the small mercy and the small cruelty of it, both that they'd just begun to feel at home. And then there was a 6th young person who'd be there that night, not a Sharp at all. Dana Wingate, 17. A friend of John's from down in Quincy. Just a teenage boy spending time with his buddy. Just along for the evening. I want you to hold all of them in your mind. Sue trying to start over. John 15 and acting older. Sheila 14. Tina 12. Rick 10. Little Greg 5. And Dana the visitor 17. Because in the histories they become a number. The 4 who died the quadruple murder. The case number on a cold file, and they were not a number. They were a tired, hopeful woman and her children and a boy who came to visit in a cabin in the pines 5 months into a brand new life. It was a Saturday night, April the 11th, 1981, and like a lot of nights everybody was scattered a little. That's the ordinary way of it, the way no one could have known to do differently. Sheila the 14-year-old was not home that night. She was right next door in the neighboring cabin at a sleepover with a friend. A few yards away, close enough to throw a stone. That short distance is the only reason she is alive to be an old woman now, and I think about that distance the way you think about a near miss on the highway. The inch, that was the whole difference. The 2 littlest boys, Rick and Greg, were in the back bedroom, and their friend Justin was with them, a boy of 12 from one of the other cabins staying over. The 3 of them in that back room together. Tina, the 12-year-old, was home, and John, the oldest, had spent the day down in Quincy with his friend Dana. The 2 of them were seen that night walking back along the highway in the dark, heading home the way teenage boys will roam and then turn for home late. They came back to cabin 28 sometime that night. Whether they walked in before the trouble started or right into the middle of it, nobody can say for certain. But they came home, and they did not leave again. Sue was there. The canyon was dark and cold, the way April still is up that high. The pines black against the sky, the river running somewhere below in the dark. An ordinary spring night in a mountain town where nothing ever happened. And somewhere in the deep of that night in the front room of that little cabin it happened. I'm not going to walk you through what was done in that room. I've made that choice with every one of these I've told, and I make it again here, and maybe more firmly here than anywhere because of the children asleep next door, because of the daughter who would open that door in a few hours, because some doors a storyteller has no business kicking open just to make you feel the cold coming through. What I'll tell you is enough, and it's already too much. 3 people, Sue and her boy John and the visiting boy Dana, were overpowered in that front room. They were bound with rope and with tape, and with electrical cord, the kind of binding that takes time and takes intent, that tells you whoever did this was not in a blind panic, but was in some terrible way working. There was a hammer. There was a knife. 3 people died in a room not much bigger than a parlor, with 3 children sleeping behind a thin wall a few feet away, and not one of those children woke in a way that saved anybody, and not one of them was harmed. And Tina, the 12-year-old, was taken out the back into the dark, into the canyon. Alive or not, when she went out that door, no one has ever been able to say. She was simply suddenly gone from the world, and the world would not learn where for 3 more years. That was the night. It was over most likely in a short and brutal stretch of the small hours, and then whoever did it walked back out into the dark, and the pines, and was gone, and the cabin sat quiet, and the 3 little boys slept on, and a few yards away Sheila slept too, not knowing she'd already lost almost everyone she had. The morning is the part that I think is unbearable, and it's the part that's seared into everyone who was around here then. It was Sunday. Sheila, the 14-year-old, woke up at the neighbor's where she'd had her sleepover, and she came home that morning for the most ordinary reason in the world. She came home to change her clothes for church. A 14-year-old girl on a Sunday morning in the mountains, walking the few yards from one cabin to the next to put on her good clothes and go to church. And she opened the door of cabin 28. I will not describe what she saw. You can carry the knowledge of it without me painting it, and she has had to carry the seeing of it every single day of a long life since. She found her mother. She found her brother. She found Dana. And she turned and ran out of that cabin and to the neighbors, screaming the way you would, the way anyone would, the way a child would, who has just had her whole family taken out of the middle of her life between Saturday night and Sunday breakfast. The deputies came that morning around 8 o'clock, and they confirmed the thing that didn't need confirming. And then going through the cabin, they found the 3 little boys in the back bedroom, Rick and Greg and young Justin, alive, unharmed, a few feet from it all. And they found that Tina was not there at all, not among the living children, not among the dead, just gone. So that's what this canyon woke up to on a Sunday morning in April of 1981. A mother and 3 young people dead in a rented cabin, 3 small children found alive beside them, and a 12-year-old girl vanished into the mountains. In a town where nothing ever happened. In a town where everybody knew everybody. And that second fact, everybody knew, everybody stopped being a comfort that morning and started being something else. Because if everybody knew everybody, then there was a fair chance that everybody knew whoever did this too. Now I have to tell you about the 3 years of not knowing where Tina was, and then about the far longer not knowing that came after, because the after is really what this story is about. For 3 years, that little girl was simply missing. And a town will do anything with a silence like that rather than sit inside it. People said maybe she'd run off though she was 12 and had never run anywhere in her life. People said maybe she'd been taken as some kind of leverage, or that she'd seen too much and been carried off because of it. Hope and dread took turns the way they do for 3 solid years. And then in the spring of 1984, a man out in the country more than 60 miles away, over in Butte County near a place called Camp 18, came across part of a human skull. and a search of that ground turned up a few more bones and a child's blanket. And the dental records said what everyone had feared for 3 years. It was Tina, so far away, left out in the open, unburied in the woods, 60-some miles from her own front door. No one could even determine how she had died. Just that she had, and that someone had carried her all that way and left her in the trees. And here the story turns, and it turns toward the thing that makes Keddy different from the other dark stories I could tell you. The thing that makes it to my mind harder than a simple mystery. Right around the time those remains were found, someone made a telephone call. An anonymous man called the authorities over in Butte County, and he told them the remains were Tina Sharp's, and he told them this before the dental records had come back, before it had been publicly confirmed, before by rights anybody but the killer should have known for sure. A voice that knew. And then that recording that call from someone who plainly knew, something he had no innocent way of knowing, was filed away in an evidence box, and it sat there forgotten for something like 30 years before an investigator working the cold case finally found it. That is the true heart of the Keddy case, and it isn't a whodunit. It's a question much worse than who. It's how did this get away? Because the evidence was there. Over the years, as people kept worrying at this case who refused to let it die, what came out was not that there were no clues. It was that there had been clues all along, and they had slipped through somebody's fingers again and again. There was a man who'd lived right there in the community. In one of the cabins, a neighbor investigators came to believe he was at the center of it, along with a friend of his who'd been staying with him, an older man with a cloudy past who'd told people things about himself that turned out not to be true. The neighbor, when first questioned, mentioned that he was missing a hammer. Years and years later, 35 years later, a man with a metal detector looking for a lost ring near the old resort turned up a claw hammer in a pond down the road from where the cabin had stood. The very kind of thing the man had said went missing, just lying in the pond by the scene all that time. There was talk of a witness who'd seen that same man burning clothes the morning after. There was a letter that man wrote not long after the murders that the people who've studied it say reads very much like the words of a guilty soul. There was eventually, in our own time, DNA pulled off the binding from the scene. And the two men that all of this pointed toward, the neighbor and his friend, were never arrested, never charged, not one day in a courtroom for any of it. They died, the two of them, years apart, in their own time of their own causes, free men, while this canyon and that surviving family lived on without their answer. The case is to this day officially unsolved, not because no one has any idea, but because the pieces that might have closed it were dropped or overlooked, or filed in the wrong box, or found too late, found after the men most suspected of it were already in their graves and beyond the reach of any law. I've turned that over for a long time, and here's where I've come to rest on it. There's a kind of unsolved case that's a true mystery where the dark just swallowed the answer and never gave it back, and you can almost make a sad peace with that the way you make peace with a storm. Keddy isn't that. Keddy feels like a case where the answer was in the room the whole time close, as that thin wall and the people whose job it was to reach out and take hold of it simply didn't. And that's a harder thing to live next to than a mystery. A mystery you can blame on fate. This you have to blame on people. On a botched morning, a dropped thread, a tape in a box, a town's reluctance to believe that the man you waved to could be the man who did it. So how did the community live with it? I can answer that one plainly because I watched it happen. It didn't. Keddy died. That's the truth of it. A place like that runs on people wanting to come to fish, to stay in the cabins, to bring their families up into the pines. And after that Sunday morning, people stopped wanting to come. Who brings their children to sleep in a cabin in the woods where a family was killed and a little girl carried off, and never a soul punished for it? The visitors fell away. The resort, already fading, went under for good. The cabins emptied out, and the forest started taking them back. The roofs sagging the porches, rotting the windows, going dark, one after another. And Cabin 28 itself stood there at the center of it for years, this ordinary little cabin that had become the most terrible address in the county. Until finally, in 2004, they condemned it and tore it down. Just took it away. And I understand why. You couldn't leave it standing. But there's something in me that flinches at it too, because when they pulled that cabin down, they pulled down the last room those people had been alive in. And now there's only a flat place in the pines where it used to be. The thrill seekers still come sometimes, the ones with their cameras, who want to stand where it happened. But the town, the living town, the place where people raised kids and borrowed tools and knew each other's names, that's mostly gone. It thinned out and fell quiet, and the woods moved in. The town itself was the casualty that didn't bleed. It just slowly stopped being a town. That's how this community lived with it in the end. It didn't reckon with it. It didn't get its day in court and its closure and its slow healing. It just emptied out. It let the buildings fall. It became a place people point to from the highway and a name in the true crime books, and not much else. There's no monument up there. There's a foundation in the trees where a cabin used to be. I'm an old man now, older by a long way than Sue Sharp ever got to be. And once in a while I still drive up the canyon, up the old road toward where Ketty was through the pines with the river down below. And I think about that thin wall and the 3 little boys who slept on the other side of it and woke up into a world with their mother gone. They're grown men now, somewhere carrying that whole night they slept through. I think about Sheila, 14, coming home to change for church, opening a door she can never close again, an old woman now who has been her whole life, the girl who found them. I think about Tina, 12 years old, carried out into the dark and left in the woods 60 miles away, and the cold voice on a forgotten tape who knew her name before the dentists did. And I think about the hardest part, the part that's different from a true mystery and worse, that there were very likely men who could have answered for this, that the answer may have been close enough to touch the whole time right here among us behind a face we knew, and that the system built to reach out and take hold of that answer fumbled it and kept fumbling it for so long that the men walked free to the ends of their natural lives and died in their own beds, while a girl's bones lay in another county and a town quietly died of the not knowing. People want a true crime story to end with a name with handcuffs with a verdict. I'd give a great deal to hand you that ending. But Ketty doesn't have one, and I think the lesson of it is exactly in the place where the ending should be and isn't. The lesson is that unsolved doesn't always mean unknowable. Sometimes it means something we let happen in slow motion through carelessness and disbelief, and the simple human refusal to imagine that the monster could be the neighbor. Sometimes a case stays open not because the truth was never within reach, but because again and again nobody quite reached. So I drive up the canyon and I come to the flat place in the pines where Cabin 28 used to be, and there's nothing there now to tell you what happened. Just the trees and the quiet and that old thin distance a few yards between the cabin that's gone and the one next door where a sleeping girl was spared. And I say their names because somebody up in this canyon ought to. Sue, John, Dana, and Tina, who was 12, and who was carried out into the dark, and who is the reason I can never quite drive past without slowing down. They were ours, and we never got them their answer. We just let the town fall down around the silence and called it the end.